The road to Ashworth was long, and Edmund Sinclair, Duke of Harcliffe, had no patience for long roads. He sat inside his carriage with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching the countryside blur past the window, fields, hedgerows, the occasional stone farmhouse. None of it interesting, none of it worth his time. He had not wanted to come. He had said so twice to his solicitor, who had listened politely and handed him the deed papers anyway. A property dispute. A tenant refusing to vacate a parcel of land on the northern edge of the Ashworth estate. The kind of thing a steward could handle. The kind of thing Edmund had people for. But the tenant had lawyers. And the lawyers had written letters. And after 4 months of letters, Edmund's solicitor had looked at him over the rim of his spectacles and said, very carefully, that perhaps his Grace's personal presence might resolve matters more efficiently. Edmund had agreed. Not because he believed it. Because he was tired of the letters. He had been tired of many things lately. The carriage rolled through a village, a small one, barely worth a name on a map. A baker's shop. A well. A handful of children chasing each other through the mud, with the absolute conviction that they were having the best moment of their lives. Edmund did not look at them. He looked at the papers in his lap. At the boundary lines drawn in careful ink. At the name of the disputing tenant, one Gerald Harwell, and the name of the property, Millfield Cottage, 2 acres, eastern boundary contested. Gerald Harwell. Edmund didn't know the name. He would by the end of the week. The carriage slowed. Edmund looked up from the papers. They were still in the village, or just past it, where the road narrowed and bent around a low stone wall. His driver had pulled the horses to a cautious walk, and Edmund could see why. There was a boy on the road. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Small, with dark hair that needed cutting, wearing a coat that was slightly too large for his shoulders, the sleeves pushed up to free his hands. He was not running. He was not playing. He was standing very still in the middle of the road, watching a frog. Just standing there. Completely absorbed. As if the entire world had narrowed to this one small green creature, sitting in the mud at his feet. The carriage rolled to a full stop. Edmund's driver called down from the box, "Boy. Off the road, if you please." The child looked up. And Edmund stopped breathing. It was not a dramatic thing at first. The boy simply looked toward the carriage with wide, dark eyes, calm, unafraid, faintly curious. The way a child looks at something that has interrupted his frog watching. But Edmund had seen that look before. He had seen it in a portrait. A small portrait, painted when he was 4 years old, that had hung in the upper gallery of Harcliffe Hall for as long as he could remember. His mother had commissioned it. A serious little boy with dark eyes and a composed expression, as if he had already decided that the world was something to be observed carefully before acting upon it. That portrait was 30 years old. And this boy, standing in the mud with a frog at his feet, looked exactly like it. Edmund told himself he was imagining things. He told himself it was the light, the particular gray softness of an English afternoon playing tricks on a tired mind. He told himself that dark-haired boys with serious expressions were not uncommon, that he was looking for something that wasn't there. That 6 years of something he refused to name, as guilt had made him see ghosts in the faces of strangers. The boy stepped aside. He picked up the frog first, carefully, with both hands, carrying it to the grass at the side of the road before he moved himself. And then he stood by the wall and watched the carriage pass with those quiet, watchful eyes. Edmund turned in his seat to watch him through the rear window. The boy raised one hand. A small wave. Entirely unself-conscious. Edmund did not wave back. He sat very still, watching the child grow smaller as the carriage moved away, and something cold moved through his chest that he could not account for and did not wish to examine. He looked down at the papers in his lap. Gerald Harwell. Millfield Cottage. Eastern boundary contested. He could not read the words. The carriage rounded a bend, and the village came back into view from a different angle, the far end of the main road, where a small market had apparently just finished. Stalls were being folded away, baskets being loaded onto carts. The ordinary afternoon business of an ordinary English village. And there was the boy again. He had come around the other way, running now, coat flapping, heading toward the market with the purposeful sprint of a child who has spotted someone he knows. Edmund watched him without meaning to. Watched the small figure weave between the folding stalls, dodge around a woman carrying eggs, come to a stop beside. A woman. Her back was to the carriage. She was speaking to a stall holder, reaching for something on the table, and the boy ran straight into her side and grabbed her hand without breaking stride, the way children do when they are certain of their welcome. She turned at his touch, turned to look at him first, that instinctive pivot of a mother making sure her child is whole, and then, as if sensing something, she looked up. She looked directly at the carriage. She looked directly at Edmund. 6 years. 6 years since he had last seen her face, and he had told himself with great conviction that he had forgotten it, that he had chosen to forget it, that a man of his position and discipline did not carry the memory of a woman who had betrayed him, whose illegitimate child he had. Eleanor. Her name arrived in his mind, with the weight of something that had never truly left. She had not moved. She was still looking at him, and her face had gone very still, not afraid, not angry, not the dozen things he might have expected. Just still. The way a person goes still when they are deciding something important very quickly. The boy tugged her hand. She looked down at him. She said something. Edmund could not hear it through the carriage window, and she turned away, drawing the child with her, walking in the opposite direction without hurrying. She did not look back. Edmund sat in the moving carriage with his hands flat on the papers in his lap, and his mind doing something he could not stop. The boy's face. Eleanor's child. That portrait in the upper gallery. He thought about the evidence his mother had placed before him 6 years ago. A letter. A witness statement. A doctor's report. He had read them all. He had believed them all because they were there, because they were detailed, because his mother had never given him reason to, because he had been so certain, so absolutely certain that. He stopped. He made himself stop. He was a rational man. He dealt in evidence, in facts, in what could be proven and measured and documented. A child who resembled him meant nothing. Children resembled all manner of people. It was coincidence. It was the light. It was 6 years of something he refused to call grief making him see what he wanted, what he feared, in the face of a stranger's son. Eleanor had betrayed him. He had the evidence. He looked out the window at the passing fields and said nothing and thought about her face, the way it had gone still when she saw him, and the way she had turned away without hurrying, without flinching, without any of the guilt he had always, somewhere, expected to see. Ashworth House was exactly as dull as Edmund had expected, a serviceable manor, well-maintained, belonging to a cousin who spent most of his time in Scotland. Edmund was shown to his rooms, offered tea, and left to himself. He stood at the window. From here he could see the edge of the village, the church spire, a row of rooftops, the lane that led down toward the market. Somewhere in that direction was a woman named Eleanor who had once been his wife, and a boy who looked like a painting of Edmund at 4 years old, and a man named Gerald Harwell, whose property dispute had brought Edmund here by what he was only now beginning to suspect, was not entirely coincidence. He was a rational man. He would get the facts. That night he asked his valet, casually, the way a man asks questions he does not wish to seem too interested in, about the village, about its residents, about any notable families in the area. His valet mentioned several names. One of them was Harwell. "The Harwells," said Edmund, his voice perfectly even. "Do you know anything of them?" "Only that they've been here some years, your grace. The wife is well, it said she's very genteel. Not from this area originally. And there's a young boy, I believe. About 5 or 6. Edmund said nothing. "Will that be all, your grace?" "Yes," said Edmund. "That will be all." He sat alone in the firelight for a long time after his valet left. 5 or 6 years old. He had not thought, he had not let himself think, about how old Aliner's child would be by now. He had not let himself think about the child at all. The child was not his. The child was the proof of her betrayal. He had buried that entire corner of his past under 6 years of deliberate silence, and had considered it, on his better days, dealt with. 5 or 6 years old. And a face like a portrait that had hung on his wall since before he could read. Edmund Sinclair was not a man who prayed. But sitting in that firelight, in that borrowed house, in that quiet village where fate had apparently decided to settle old debts, he found himself making something that felt, uncomfortably, like a bargain. Let me be wrong, he thought. Let the boy be Gerald Harwell's in every way that matters, and let me leave this place in a week with my tenant dispute resolved and my conscience intact. Let me be wrong. He did not sleep well that night. And in the morning, when he walked into the village to meet with his solicitor, the first person he saw was the boy standing at the baker's window, pressing his nose against the glass, wearing that too large coat. The boy turned around and smiled at him. The same smile, the same eyes, the same expression from the portrait in the upper gallery of Harcliffe Hall. Edmund stood very still on the cobblestones and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the thing he had spent 6 years refusing to feel, that he was not wrong. He was not wrong at all. Edmund did not go to his meeting that morning. He sent his solicitor a note, brief, impersonal, citing a minor indisposition, and then he sat in the parlor of Ashworth House with a cold cup of tea, and did something he had spent 6 years training himself not to do. He remembered. 6 years earlier. Harcliffe Hall. Aliner had been happy that morning. That was the detail Edmund's memory kept returning to, though he had tried many times to remove it. She had been happy. She had come down to breakfast later than usual. She was 7 months along by then, and the stairs took more effort than she liked to admit, and she had been wearing a pale blue dress that had grown tight at the waist, and her hair was not quite finished, and she had laughed at herself when she sat down, one hand resting on her stomach with the easy, unconscious tenderness of a woman who has already decided she loves the person growing inside her. Edmund had watched her from across the table and thought, he remembered thinking this clearly, that he was a fortunate man. That was the last uncomplicated thought he had for 6 years. His mother had arrived at 11 o'clock. This was not unusual. Lady Sinclair visited Harcliffe Hall often. She had, in fact, never entirely relinquished the sense that it was still her house, despite Edmund's marriage, despite Aliner's quiet and persistent attempts to make it hers. Lady Sinclair moved through the hall with the authority of a woman who had run it for 30 years, and she sat down across from Edmund in his study, with the precise posture of someone who has been preparing for a conversation for a very long time. She placed a leather folder on the desk between them. "I need you to look at something," she said. "And I need you to be calm." Edmund had looked at the folder, then at his mother. Her face was composed, carefully, deliberately composed, in the way of someone holding back something enormous. "What is this?" "Open it." There were 3 documents inside the folder. The first was a letter, written in a hand Edmund did not immediately recognize, neat, masculine, careful. It addressed Alina by her first name. It spoke of meetings, of feelings that had grown beyond what either of them had intended, of a night some 8 months prior, when what had been growing between them had finally. Edmund had put the letter down. He had picked it up again because he was a rational man, and rational men did not make decisions based on the first 10 seconds of shock. He read it again, more slowly. The second document was a signed statement from a housemaid, a woman who had been employed at Harcliffe Hall for 2 years, a woman Edmund vaguely recognized, a small, quiet woman who had given her notice 3 months ago, citing a family matter. The statement described, in plain and painful detail, having witnessed Alina leaving the house on 3 separate occasions after midnight, on dates that corresponded precisely with the letter. The third document was a medical report. Edmund read the third document twice, and then set it very carefully on the desk, and did not touch it again. The dates, the doctor's careful, neutral language, the implication, laid out in ink that did not flinch, that the child Alina was carrying had been conceived at a time when Edmund had been away, a full 2 weeks in Edinburgh on parliamentary business, and that the dates, measured against what the doctor had observed, did not align with Edmund's return. He sat very still. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," said his mother. "It matters enormously. Where did you get them?" Lady Sinclair folded her hands in her lap. "The housemaid came to me. She was frightened. She didn't know what to do. As for the letter, it was found." "Found where?" "In Alina's room. In the lining of a travel case she has not used since spring." Edmund said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, the gardens were bright and ordinary. Somewhere in the house he could hear Alina's voice. She was speaking to one of the upstairs maids, something about curtain fabric, entirely domestic, entirely calm. He thought about her face at breakfast, her hand on her stomach, the ease of it. He thought about Edinburgh. He thought about the dates. He sent for her. She came into the study with a small smile, the smile of a woman who has been called by her husband and expects nothing alarming, because nothing alarming has ever happened in the middle of a Tuesday. She saw his face. The smile didn't disappear immediately. It faded slowly, the way light fades when a cloud moves over the sun. "Edmund." "What?" He slid the letter across the desk without speaking. She looked at it. He watched her read it. He watched her face go through several things in quick succession: confusion, then something sharper, then a kind of fear that he catalogued, in his current state, as guilt. "Where did you get this? Is it yours?" "No. Edmund, I have never seen this letter in my—" "The medical report." He pushed the second document toward her. "The dates." She looked at it. Her hand had started to shake, very slightly, just her fingers. "These dates are wrong. Edmund, whoever wrote this has made an error, or they have lied, because I was here. I was here the entire time you were in Edinburgh. I never—" "The housemaid," he said. "Margaret." She signed a statement. "Margaret left 3 months ago." "Yes." After she came to my mother. Alina went very still. Then she looked slowly, as if she already knew what she would find at Lady Sinclair, who had remained in the corner of the room, quiet and composed and watchful throughout. Something moved across Alina's face. Not guilt. Something older than guilt and more certain. Lady Sinclair, she said quietly. Of course. Don't, said Edmund. His voice came out harder than he intended. Don't make accusations. Not now. Not with this in front of me. Edmund, please listen to me. She stepped toward him. He stepped back just slightly, just enough, and the look on her face when he did it was something he would carry for a very long time without ever examining it too closely. This child is yours. I swear to you on everything I have ever held sacred, this child is yours. I have never been unfaithful to you. I have never even. The dates, Alina. The dates are wrong. 3 documents. 3 separate sources. All of them wrong. All of them lies. Edmund. Enough. He had said it quietly. That was the part he could not forgive himself for later. Not that he had been loud, not that he had raged, but that he had been so terribly, devastatingly quiet. I want you out of this house by nightfall. Alina didn't move. Edmund. I will arrange for funds to be sent to an address of your choosing. You will not contact me. You will not contact anyone in my family. The child, he stopped. Started again. Whatever arrangements need to be made regarding the child, my solicitor will handle them. I am 7 months pregnant. I am aware. It is October. It is raining. I am aware, he said again, and turned to look out the window, because he could not look at her any more, because something in the way she was standing, something in the absolute absence of performance in her face, was making it very difficult to hold on to what he needed to hold on to. He heard her take a breath. Long, slow, the kind of breath a person takes when they are deciding not to fall apart. I will go, she said, because you have made it clear that nothing I say will reach you today. But I want you to hear one thing, Edmund. One thing, and then I will go. He said nothing. She took his silence as permission. One day you will know the truth. You will know exactly what happened in this room, and who brought those papers to your desk, and why. And on that day, I will not be here. I will not be waiting. I will not have kept a candle in the window for a man who chose documents over his own wife's word. She paused. I hope, for your sake, that the truth finds you before it is too late to matter. She left the study. He heard her footsteps in the hall, unhurried, steady, and then the sound of her on the stairs, and then nothing. Lady Sinclair rose from her chair. You did the right thing, she said. It will hurt now. These things always do. But you did the right thing. Edmund did not answer. He stood at the window and watched the rain come down across the gardens and listened to the sounds of the house, servants moving quietly, doors opening and closing, the careful orchestrated sounds of a household in the process of erasing someone from itself, and he did not move. 3 hours later, a carriage left through the front gates. Edmund stood at the upstairs window. He watched it go. In the parlor of Ashworth House, the fire had burned low. Edmund's tea was stone cold. He had not touched it. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him, staring at nothing, doing the arithmetic he had refused to do for 6 years. Edinburgh. 2 weeks away. His return. He had always been good at numbers. Figures, dates, measurements, these were his domain. He had simply, deliberately, chosen not to apply them to this particular problem. Because the documents had been there, Because three sources were three sources. Because it was easier, in the wreckage of everything, to believe the evidence than to believe that his mother had. He stopped. He made himself go further this time. Because it was easier to believe the evidence than to believe that his mother, who had never liked Eleanor, who had said so before the wedding and had never quite stopped saying it, who had made no secret of her preference for a different match, a more strategic match, a match that consolidated rather than complicated, had constructed 3 documents and a dismissed housemaid, and a medical report to take from him, the one thing that had made the last several years of his life feel like something worth having. He sat with that thought. He let himself sit with it. Outside, the village went about its morning. Somewhere out there, a small boy in a too large coat was doing whatever small boys did on gray October mornings. Watching frogs, perhaps. Pressing his nose against bakery windows. Smiling at strangers with a smile Edmund had last seen in a portrait 30 years old. He had sent her out into the rain. 7 months pregnant, in October, with nothing but the quiet dignity she had refused to surrender, and one promise she had made to a man who did not deserve it. One day you will know the truth. Edmund rose from his chair. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat from the table by the door, and he walked out of Ashworth House into the gray morning air with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something very large and very bad, and who has decided, with every disciplined fiber of his considerable will, to find out exactly how bad it is. He was going to get the facts. All of them this time. Starting with Gerald Harwell. Eleanor Harwell woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. This was not a habit she had chosen. It was one she had developed, slowly and without noticing, over the course of 6 years. The body's answer to a life that required her to be ready before anyone else was asking. She would lie still for exactly 1 minute in the gray pre-dawn quiet, listening for James, and when she heard nothing she would rise, dress without lighting a candle, and go downstairs to start the kitchen fire herself. The cook arrived at 6. Eleanor was always there first. Gerald, on the mornings he was home, slept until 9. Millfield Cottage was not, strictly speaking, a cottage. It had 8 rooms, a serviceable garden, and a parlor that Eleanor had made genuinely pleasant over the years with the kind of patient, economical effort that goes entirely unnoticed until the day it stops. She had hung curtains in the right colors. She had arranged furniture to catch the afternoon light. She had planted sweet peas along the eastern wall because James liked to watch bees, and the bees liked sweet peas, and some pleasures cost nothing. It was not Harcliffe Hall. She did not allow herself to think about Harcliffe Hall. James came downstairs at 6:30, as he always did, with his hair going in 3 directions and his left stocking half off, and a look of absolute morning contentment that Eleanor suspected he had been born with, and that no amount of difficult circumstance had yet managed to remove. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her make porridge and told her, in great detail, about a dream he'd had involving a talking horse who was also, somehow, the village blacksmith. Eleanor listened to every word. This was the part of the day she guarded most fiercely. This hour before Gerald woke, before the house required her to be a wife instead of a mother, when it was just the two of them and the fire and James's voice filling the kitchen with everything that still, despite everything, made her life feel like something worth having. She looked at him across the table, really looked, the way she still sometimes allowed herself, and she saw Edmund's jaw and Edmund's eyes, and the particular way Edmund had of going completely still when something caught his attention. James was doing it now, watching a spider make its way across the window glass, with the focused, scientific interest of a boy who found the world endlessly worth examining. Eleanor looked away. She stirred the porridge and said nothing, and loved her son with the ferocious, uncomplicated love that had been, for 6 years, the only feeling she permitted herself to have without reservation. Gerald Harwell came downstairs at 9:15, which was later than usual, which meant he had been at the decanter again last night after Eleanor had gone to bed. She could always tell. Not from his face. Gerald was skilled at faces. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him, how easily he arranged his expression into whatever the moment required. She could tell from the way he moved through the kitchen doorway. A fraction too careful. A fraction too deliberate, like a man navigating by memory rather than by sight. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," said Eleanor. "There's tea." Gerald sat down. He looked at James with the particular expression he reserved for James, not unkind, but not warm either. The expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he had agreed to, without fully understanding its terms. "Boy," he said. "Good morning, sir," said James, without looking up from the spider. Gerald picked up his tea. Eleanor poured her own and stood at the window and looked at the garden and calculated, as she did every morning, the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. People sometimes asked Eleanor, carefully, obliquely, in the way that English people ask questions they are not entirely sure they should be asking, how she had come to settle in Ashworth. It was not her home county. She had no family in the area. And yet here she was. She always gave the same answer. She had come through the area some years ago and found it agreeable. Gerald had been kind. It had seemed like a sensible arrangement. All of this was technically true. What she did not say was that she had arrived in Ashworth 6 years ago in October with 40 pounds, a leather bag, and a child who had decided to come into the world 3 weeks early, as if even James, at the very beginning of his existence, had been in a hurry to leave Harcliffe Hall behind. She had been taken in by a widow named Mrs. Patton, who asked no questions and charged modest rent, and brought broth without being asked during the worst of it. Eleanor had stayed through the winter. And in the spring, Gerald Harwell had begun. Calling a widower himself, respectable, financially stable, with the air of a man who wanted a particular kind of wife, and had decided, efficiently, that Eleanor would do. She had not loved him. She had known going in that she would not love him. She had buried that particular capacity in the ruins of a different life, and had no expectation of retrieving it. What she had wanted was a roof, a name that gave James some protection, a context in which to raise her son, without the word illegitimate following him through every door he tried to open. Gerald had offered all of those things. She had not known then about the drinking. She had not known about the debts. She had not known about the men who sometimes came to the house late at night and left before morning, and the conversations she was not supposed to hear, and the name, one particular name that appeared now and again in those conversations like a stone in still water. Sinclair. There was a small portrait in Eleanor's dressing room. It was not displayed. It was kept in a flat wooden box that had once held her mother's correspondence, tucked behind a stack of hat boxes on the highest shelf, the kind of place that requires a chair to reach, which meant that it was not reached often, which was exactly the point. She had painted it herself 3 years ago on a Sunday afternoon when Gerald was away, and James was napping, and the house was quiet enough that she allowed herself, just briefly, to take the box down. It was a portrait of Edmund. Not from memory alone, she had worked from a miniature she had kept, a small formal thing painted the year they married, which she had hidden in the lining of a glove, and which had therefore survived the night she left with almost nothing. The portrait she had painted was larger than the miniature. more detailed. She had spent the afternoon getting the eyes right, the particular quality of attention in them, the way they could go, in the space of a moment, from warm to unreadable. She had not painted it because she was not over him. She had painted it because James deserved to know someday what his father looked like. Because she was not going to construct a fiction around her son's origins, not entirely, not forever. Because there would come a day when James would ask, and she would need to show him something true. That was what she told herself. She put it away again after an hour, and did not take it down for another 4 months. She had not expected to see him. She had been at the market because she went to the market every Thursday, and it was Thursday, and she needed ribbon and butter and a new candle mold, and there was no reason, no conceivable reason, to expect that the Duke of Harcliffe would be passing through Ashworth on a Thursday in October in a very good carriage going rather slowly. James had found her at the ribbon stall. He had grabbed her hand in that unceremonious way of his, and she had turned to check on him. She always turned to check on him. It was automatic. It was permanent. And then some instinct she could not have named made her look further, out toward the road. At the carriage. At the figure inside it. She had known him in an instant. She would have known him in less. She had spent 6 years practicing not thinking about his face, which had given her an exceptionally detailed memory of it. He was looking directly at her. She did not allow herself to feel anything for the 3 seconds it took to make a decision. Then she looked down at James, at his upturned face, his dark eyes, his expression of mild curiosity about whatever his mother was staring at, and something moved through her chest like cold water. She turned away. She walked away at a measured pace, James's hand in hers, and she did not look back, and she did not allow her breathing to change until they had turned the corner and the carriage was no longer visible. Then she stopped, put one hand on the stone wall beside her. Breathed. James looked up at her. "Mama, are you unwell?" "No, darling," she said. "I'm perfectly well." She was a very good liar when she needed to be. 6 years of practice. She put James to bed at 7. She read him 2 chapters of the book they were working through, something involving pirates and a missing map, which James considered the height of literary achievement, and she sat with him until his breathing slowed and his hand went loose around hers. Then she went to her dressing room. She pulled the chair to the wardrobe, climbed it, reached to the back of the highest shelf, past the hat boxes, and took down the wooden box. She sat on the floor with it in her lap for a long time without opening it. He was here. He was in Ashworth, which meant he was here for the property dispute. Gerald had mentioned it, weeks ago, with the careful casualness of a man mentioning something he does not want to appear to care about. The Duke of Harcliffe. The contested boundary. Edmund was here on business and would leave when the business was concluded and would never know, had no reason to know, that the woman at the market was. But James had been on the road that morning. James, who looked exactly like that portrait in the box. Eleanor opened the box. She looked at the painting for a long time. Then she closed it, put it back on the shelf, and sat in the quiet of her dressing room with her hands in her lap and the particular expression of a woman who has spent 6 years building a careful life and has just felt the ground shift under it. From somewhere downstairs came the sound of the front door. Gerald home late. And behind it something else. A voice she didn't recognize. Low, quiet, the kind of voice that doesn't want to carry. Eleanor stood. Moved to the door. Listened. Gerald's voice, then the stranger's. A word repeated twice that stopped her breathing. Sinclair. She stood very still in the dark of the upstairs corridor with her hand on the door frame and her heart doing something loud and inconvenient. and she understood, with the sudden, sickening clarity of a woman who has been patient long enough, that Edmund Sinclair had not arrived in Ashworth by accident, and that whatever had brought him here was connected, in ways she could not yet see, to the man she had married and the name he was not supposed to know, and the debt he owed to people who did not forgive debts. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. And in the morning, when James came downstairs with his hair in 3 directions and told her about another dream, this one involving a duke who could talk to horses, Alina poured his porridge and said nothing and decided, quietly and without drama, that she was done being careful. It was time to find out exactly what Gerald Harwell had to do with the Sinclairs. Before someone else did. Edmund Sinclair had built his reputation, in part, on knowing when a thing did not add up. In Parliament, in business, in the long, careful management of an estate that encompassed 11 properties across 4 counties, he had learned that the most dangerous errors were not the obvious ones. The obvious ones announced themselves. The dangerous errors were the ones that looked like everything was fine. That looked, in fact, slightly too fine. Too neat. Too resolved. He was thinking about this as he walked through Ashworth Village on Friday morning, with no particular destination, an extremely particular purpose. 3 documents. 6 years ago. 3 separate sources, all pointing to the same conclusion, all arriving on the same morning, all delivered by his mother. He had believed them because they were there. Because they were detailed. Because he had been in shock, and his mother had been calm, and Alina had seemed guilty. He thought about Alina's face now. Not the face he had catalogued as guilt 6 years ago. The face she had made when she saw Lady Sinclair in the corner of the room. Not guilt. Recognition. Of course, she had said. As if she had always known it would come from that direction, and had only been waiting to find out when. His meeting with the local solicitor regarding the Harwell property dispute lasted 23 minutes, which was 18 minutes longer than Edmund needed, and 5 minutes shorter than the solicitor would have liked. Edmund agreed to the relevant terms, signed the relevant papers, and then, very casually, the way a man asks questions he has already decided are important, mentioned that he had encountered a Mrs. Harwell in the village, and believed she might be an acquaintance of an acquaintance. The solicitor brightened. People in small villages always brighten when asked about other people in small villages. It is one of the more reliable constants of English life. Mrs. Harwell, yes, charming woman. Came to the area perhaps 6 years ago, I believe. Before my time here, but I understand she arrived rather suddenly. Married Mr. Harwell within the year. And Mr. Harwell, said Edmund. A local man. Not originally, no. He came from somewhere in the north. He has various business interests. The solicitor's voice had shifted, very slightly, on the words various business interests. The shift of a man choosing diplomatic language for something that did not entirely deserve it. What sort of interests? A pause. He keeps rather varied company, Your Grace. That is perhaps the most accurate way I can put it. Edmund noted the pause. He noted the phrasing. He thanked the solicitor and left. There was a letter waiting for him at Ashworth House when he returned. He had written to his London secretary the previous evening, a carefully worded request for any information available regarding one Gerald Harwell, business connections, financial standing, known associates. The response, for a letter sent barely 24 hours ago, was impressively fast, which meant his secretary had not needed to look far. Edmund read it standing in the hall, still in his coat. Gerald Harwell had debts. Significant ones, accumulated over several years through a combination of gambling, failed speculation, and what the letter delicately described as arrangements with parties of uncertain reputation. He had twice narrowly avoided legal proceedings. His current financial position was, according to Edmund's secretary's sources, precarious at best. And he had buried near the bottom of the letter, in the same careful tone, a long-standing connection to a firm of money lenders whose primary London patron was known to operate under the protection of a peer of the realm. The peer's name was not given, but the firm's name was. Edmund had seen that firm's name before, in his mother's household accounts. 3 years ago, when he had been reviewing her finances after his father's death, and she had explained, briefly and without elaboration, that she had made some investments through an intermediary. He stood in the hall for a long time. Then he called for his valet and asked him to arrange a private meeting with the oldest member of the Ashworth House staff, the housekeeper, who had been in service locally for 40 years and who, in Edmund's experience, knew considerably more about the area's residents than anyone had ever asked her. Her name was Mrs. Bourne, and she was 71 years old, and she had the expression of a woman who has seen everything twice and found it only mildly surprising the second time. She sat across from Edmund in the small sitting room off the kitchen and folded her hands and waited to see what sort of questions this Duke was going to ask and whether he was the sort of man worth answering honestly. Edmund asked her about Gerald Harwell. Mrs. Bourne looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What would you like to know, Your Grace?" "Whatever you think I should." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "He drinks. Not so that strangers notice, but the village notices. He has men come to the house late at night, different men, sometimes, but the same type of men. He is not cruel to the boy, but he is not kind either. And Mrs. Harwell." She stopped. "Mrs. Harwell," Edmund repeated quietly. "She manages," said Mrs. Bourne, with a particular emphasis on the word manages that communicated, without saying anything directly, everything Edmund needed to understand about the texture of a leaner's daily life. "She is well liked here." She is a good woman, Your Grace. A very good woman who came to us in difficult circumstances and has made the best of what she was given." She looked at him steadily when she said it, as if she knew or suspected more about those difficult circumstances than she intended to say. Edmund held her gaze. "The boy," he said. "James. How old is he?" "5, Your Grace. 6 in December." Edmund did the arithmetic he had been doing for 3 days. He had it memorized by now. "Thank you, Mrs. Bourne," he said. "You have been very helpful." Mrs. Bourne rose, smoothed her apron, and moved toward the door. Then she stopped. "Your Grace," she said without turning around. "The boy has your eyes." She left before he could respond. Thomas Reeve had been Edmund's personal footman for 11 years before he left Harcliffe Hall service to marry a woman from Wiltshire and open a modest inn on the road south of Ashworth. Edmund had written a reference. He had attended the wedding. He had not thought about Thomas Reeve in 4 years. He was thinking about him now, because Thomas Reeve had been present at Harcliffe Hall 6 years ago. And because Thomas Reeve was, in Edmund's memory, constitutionally incapable of lying convincingly to someone he respected. The inn was called the Miller's Rest. It was a 20-minute ride from Ashworth House, which Edmund completed in 15. Thomas was behind the bar when Edmund walked in, and his face performed, in rapid succession, the full range of emotions available to a man who is surprised, alarmed, guilty, and trying very hard to appear merely welcoming. Edmund sat down at the bar. He ordered nothing. He said very quietly, "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Whatever you say, you will not be punished for it. You have my word." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands on the bar. "It was Lady Sinclair," he said. His voice was low, and it was miserable, and it was the voice of a man who has been waiting for this conversation for 6 years. "She came to me 2 weeks before, maybe 3. She said she needed someone on the staff to confirm a statement. She said it was important. She said," he stopped. "She paid me, Your Grace. £50. I had debts and she paid me £50 and I signed the statement, and I have thought about it every day since. The statement about Mrs. About Eleanor. About her leaving the house at night." "It was false," said Thomas. "All of it. She never left. Not once. I know because I was there. I was always there. It was my post. She never left that house after dark, not a single night. I lied, Your Grace. I lied, and he stopped again. Swallowed. She was put out in October. In the rain. 7 months gone. And I signed the paper that did it." Edmund's hands were flat on the bar. Very still. Very deliberate. "The doctor's report," he said. "Do you know anything about how it was obtained?" "I know the doctor," said Thomas quietly. "Dr. Alcott. He retired the year after. Moved abroad. He and Lady Sinclair, they were known to each other from before. I don't know what was said between them. But I know the dates in that report were not what he told Mrs. Sinclair in the summer. I heard him myself, in August, telling her the confinement was expected in January. And then in October the report said different. Edmund said nothing. January. The child was expected in January, which meant conception in April, which was not Edinburgh, which was home, which was exactly when Edmund had been home. He rode back to Ashworth House slowly. This was not because he was uncertain. He was, in fact, more certain than he had been about anything in 6 years. The certainty sat in his chest like a stone, heavy, immovable and sharp at every edge. His mother had forged a letter, bribed a footman, arranged a false medical report through a physician who had since conveniently left the country. She had constructed, with patience and precision and what must have been months of planning, the exact architecture of evidence needed to convince a rational man that his wife had betrayed him. And he had believed it. He had believed it because he was rational, and rational men believe evidence. Because the documents were there, and Eleanor's word was only her word, and his mother had never, had always, he had trusted. He stopped the horse at the top of the hill above the village. Below him, in the late afternoon light, Ashworth spread out in its ordinary, quiet way. Smoke from chimneys. A dog barking somewhere. The lane that led past the market, past the bakery, down to the eastern edge of the village where Millfield Cottage sat behind its stone wall with its sweet peas gone to seed for winter. Eleanor was down there. Eleanor, who had told him the truth in his study 6 years ago while he stared out the window because he could not bear to look at her. Who had walked out into the October rain with £40 and a child who was coming too soon. Who had built a life, a careful, economical, genuinely decent life, out of what he had left her with. Who had, he now understood, married Gerald Harwell. Gerald Harwell, with his late-night visitors and his uncertain finances, and his connection to a firm that traced back, through careful and deliberate layers, to Lady Sinclair's household accounts. Not a coincidence. Not a coincidence at all. Edmund sat on his horse at the top of the hill and looked at the village below him and understood, fully and without mitigation, the shape of what his mother had done. She had not simply removed Alina from his life. She had placed her somewhere she could be watched, controlled, kept within reach of people who owed Lady Sinclair favors, in a house with a man who owed Lady Sinclair money, in a situation from which Alina could not easily leave without losing the one thing, her son's stability, that she would never risk. It was not cruelty for its own sake. Lady Sinclair was not cruel for its own sake. It was architecture. It was the long, patient construction of a situation that served her purposes, maintained her control, and kept Edmund's heir, because she must have known, she must have always known within her indirect reach. Edmund turned his horse toward Ashworth House. He needed to write a letter to his mother, and he needed to choose his words very, very carefully, because the wrong ones would warn her. And Lady Sinclair, warned, was considerably more dangerous than Lady Sinclair surprised. Edmund had not planned to go near Millfield Cottage. He had, in fact, made a very clear decision the previous evening, sitting at the writing desk in his borrowed room at Ashworth House, with his letter to his mother half-drafted in front of him, that he would proceed carefully, methodically, that he would gather the remaining facts he needed before doing anything that could not be undone, that he would not go near Alina, or near the cottage, or near the boy, until he understood the full shape of what he was walking into. This was the rational course of action. He had set out the following morning for a walk along the eastern lane, purely for the air, purely for the exercise, and had arrived, by a route he declined to examine too closely, at the stone wall that ran along the boundary of the Millfield Cottage garden. He stopped, told himself he would turn back in a moment. From inside the garden came the sound of a small boy conducting a very serious conversation with what appeared, from the evidence available, to be a stick. James was alone. He was crouched in the far corner of the garden near the bare stalks of what had been, in summer, a considerable quantity of sweet peas, and he was holding a stick approximately twice as long as his arm, and he was engaged in what Edmund gradually understood to be a military campaign against an enemy fortress represented by a stack of stones. The campaign appeared to be going well for James's side. Edmund stood at the wall and watched and told himself, for the third time, that he was about to turn back. James looked up. He did not look startled. He looked at Edmund with the calm, appraising expression of a child who has been raised by a careful woman and has therefore learned to take the measure of strangers before deciding what to do with them. Then he said, "You're the man from the road." "I am," said Edmund. "You were in the carriage." "Yes." James considered this. "Are you lost?" Edmund looked at the lane behind him, then back at the boy. "I don't believe so." "You look like you might be," said James, with the frank diagnostic confidence of someone who has decided to be helpful regardless of whether it is wanted. People who stop and look at walls usually are. Edmund found, to his considerable surprise, that he almost smiled. "I was walking. I stopped to rest." "You can come in if you like," said James. "Mama says we should be hospitable to travelers. I don't know if that means people who are just walking, but I think it probably does." Edmund should have said no. He was aware, clearly and in real time, that he should have said no. "Thank you," he said, and opened the garden gate. James showed him the fortress. Edmund crouched beside it and examined it seriously, because it deserved serious examination. The stones had been selected with some care, the larger ones at the base, the arrangement not entirely unlike actual defensive architecture, and he said so. James looked pleased in the careful way of a child who is pleased, but does not want to seem too eager about it. I read about castles, he said. In a book. Mama reads to me every night, but sometimes I look at the pictures by myself during the day. What kind of books? All kinds. Right now we're reading about pirates. Before that it was natural history. That's animals and plants and things. I like the insects best. Mama doesn't like insects, but she reads about them anyway because I do. He said this with perfect matter-of-factness, as if it had not occurred to him that a mother reading about insects she disliked, because her son was interested in them, was anything other than entirely normal. As if it had never crossed his mind that this might not be true of all mothers everywhere. And the stick. Is that a sword or a cannon? James looked at the stick. It's a battering ram, he said. Swords don't work on fortresses. You have to either go over the walls or break the gate. I'm breaking the gate. Sound strategy, said Edmund. James looked at him with sudden sharp attention. Do you know about strategy? A little. From books or from real life? Edmund thought about this. Both, I think. James nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information away for later use. My name is James, he said. What's yours? A beat. Very small. Edmund. Edmund, James repeated, testing the sound of it. That's a good name. It sounds like someone important. Edmund said nothing for a moment. Does it? Mama says names matter, said James. She says they carry weight. Mine is James William. William was my grandfather's name. I never met him, but Mama says he was kind. Edmund's father had been kind. Had been, in fact, considerably kinder than his mother, which Edmund had understood only in retrospect and too late. He did not say this. He said, Your mother sounds like a thoughtful person. She is, said James simply. She's the most thoughtful person I know. She thinks about everything before she does it. She says it saves time later. The assault on the fortress reached a critical phase approximately 10 minutes later, when James climbed onto the low stone bench at the garden's edge to gain what he explained was a tactical height advantage, lost his footing on the damp wood, and came down sideways onto the gravel path. Edmund was beside him before the boy had finished registering what had happened. James sat up, looked at his knee, a tear in the stocking, blood beginning to show at the surface. He looked at it with the focused, analytical expression of someone assessing damage rather than reacting to pain. Then his face did something, a small, involuntary crumple, quickly controlled, the face of a child who has been taught, or has taught himself, not to make a fuss. Edmund felt something move through him that he had no name for and did not try to name. All right, he said very quietly. Let me see. James extended his leg with the solemn compliance of someone submitting to a medical inspection. Edmund examined the knee. Superficial, nothing serious, but it stung, clearly, and the boy's jaw was set in the determined way of someone refusing to let it show how much. Edmund had seen that jaw before. In a mirror for 35 years. It needs cleaning, he said. Is your mother at home? She went to Mrs. Bourne's, said James. She'll be back soon. I meant to stay in the garden. A pause. I was in the garden. You were, Edmund agreed. Do you know where the kitchen is? It's my house, said James with a flicker of dignity. Of course. Can you walk on it? James stood, tested the leg, nodded once with the stoic practicality of a small soldier. They went inside together. The kitchen was warm and orderly. Edmund found a cloth, found water, found, after James directed him with the authority of a child who knows exactly where things live in his own house. A small tin of salve on the shelf above the fireplace. He cleaned the knee with as much efficiency and as little fuss as possible, and James sat on the kitchen table and watched him do it with the same focused attention he had given to the fortress and the frog and everything else that came within his orbit. "You're good at that," James observed. "I've had practice." "Did you have children?" Edmund's hand stilled. Just for a moment. "No," he said. "Brothers then?" "Or sisters?" "No. I was an only child." "Me too," said James. "I don't mind. Mama says it means I get her full attention, which is better than half attention from twice as many people." He thought about this. "I think I agree. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a brother. Someone to do the fortress with." Edmund applied the salve and said nothing, and kept his face very still. "You look like someone," said James. Edmund looked up. "Do I? I thought so on the road too. When I saw you in the carriage." James tilted his head. "There's a picture. In Mama's room. She keeps it in a box, but sometimes she takes it out, and I've seen it once. A painting of a man. You look like him." The kitchen was very quiet. "Who is the man in the painting?" Edmund asked. His voice came out level. He was rather proud of that. James looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. "I don't know," he said. "Mama never said. But she looks at it the way she looks at things that matter. Very carefully. And then she puts it away." He paused. "Do you know her?" "My mama." You both looked at each other at the market, and then she walked away very fast, which she only does when something is important. Edmund looked at this particular child with his too large coat and his stone fortresses and his absolute, unself-conscious intelligence, and felt something enormous move through him that he had no intention of showing and no ability to stop. "We knew each other," he said carefully. "A long time ago." James absorbed this. "Were you friends?" A long pause. "Yes," Edmund said. "We were friends." James nodded, satisfied. "Then what happened?" Edmund looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the salve tin in his hand. "I made a mistake," he said. "A large one. And by the time I understood it, it seemed too late to fix." "Mama says it's never too late to fix a mistake," said James. "She says the only thing worse than making one is deciding you can't undo it and not trying." Edmund said nothing for a long moment. "Your mother," he said finally, "is a very wise woman." "I know," said James. "I tell her that, but she says I'm biased." He slid off the table, tested the knee again, found it acceptable. "Are you going to try to fix it?" Edmund stood. He put the salve tin back on the shelf. He straightened his coat. And then he looked at this boy with his eyes and his jaw and Aliner's directness and Aliner's intelligence and Aliner's absolute refusal to accept a thing without examining it first. And he thought, "I have already lost 6 years. I will not lose another day." "Yes," he said. "I am going to try." She came through the garden gate 2 minutes later. She saw Edmund through the kitchen window before she reached the door. She stopped walking completely for exactly 3 seconds. And then she came inside with the expression of a woman who has had 2 minutes to prepare for something and has used them well. "James," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "What happened to your knee?" "I fell off the bench." "Edmund fixed it." Aliner looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Aliner. Between them, entirely unaware of what was passing over his head, James picked up his stick from the corner where he had left it and announced that he was returning to the campaign. The door closed behind him. Alina and Edmund stood in her kitchen in the silence that follows 6 years of things unsaid, and neither of them spoke, and the fire crackled in the grate, and outside James could be heard issuing stern military instructions to an enemy who was not going to win. "You shouldn't be here," Alina said at last. "I know," said Edmund. "Edmund." "I spoke to Thomas Reeve," he said quietly. The color left her face. Not in a dramatic way, Alina did nothing dramatically. He was remembering this, but steadily, like a tide going out. She put one hand on the kitchen table. Just rested it there, not for support, just for something solid. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "Enough to understand what I did. What was done. I am not here to. I am not going to ask anything of you, Alina. I only need you to know that I know. And that I am sorry. And that—" He stopped. Started again. He asked me if I was going to try to fix it. Alina looked at him. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, the face of a woman holding a very large number of things at once. "He's 5 years old," she said. "He doesn't understand what he's asking." "No," Edmund agreed. "But I do." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, James was narrating the fall of the fortress with great satisfaction. The battering ram had apparently succeeded. The enemy was in full retreat. Justice had been done. Alina looked at her kitchen table. At the salve tin, Edmund had put back in exactly the right place. At the cloth he had folded neatly beside the basin. Then she looked at him. "You have until Gerald comes home," she said. "Tell me what you know. All of it. And then we decide together what happens next." Edmund nodded. He pulled out a chair. And for the first time in 6 years, they sat at the same table. Alina had made tea. This was, Edmund understood, not hospitality. It was structure. Something to do with her hands while she decided how much to say, and in what order, and to what end. He had watched her move around the kitchen with the efficient calm of a woman who had long ago learned that keeping busy was the most reliable way to keep composed, and he had sat at the table and said nothing and waited. Outside, James had apparently defeated the fortress comprehensively and moved on to a new campaign involving the garden wall. Alina sat down, put 2 cups on the table, did not touch hers. "How much," she said, "do you actually know?" Thomas Reeve confirmed the statement was false. "I have reason to believe the medical report was arranged. And I have found a financial connection between my mother and Gerald Harwell that I do not believe is coincidental." Alina looked at him steadily. "It isn't." A pause. "Tell me," said Edmund. Alina picked up her cup, set it down again without drinking. And then, with the precise economy of a woman who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and has just been offered, for the first time, someone strong enough to help hold it, she told him. She had not known when she married Gerald that he was already in debt. She had known he was not wealthy, not in the way Edmund was wealthy, not in the way she had once, briefly and without quite realizing it, taken for granted. But he had a house. He had an income, modest but present. He had spoken of investments, of prospects, of a business arrangement in the north that was going to resolve itself favorably within the year. She had not investigated. She had been 23 years old with a newborn son and 40 pounds, and a widow's room in a village that was not her home, and Gerald Harwell had offered her a door she could close against the weather. She had walked through it. The business arrangement in the north had not resolved itself favorably. She had understood this gradually over the first 2 years, through the accumulation of small evidence. The way Gerald went still when certain letters arrived. The way he left early in the morning sometimes and came back late, with the careful movements of a man who had been drinking but did not want her to know. The way he occasionally looked at her, not with warmth, not even with the mild regard of a man who had made a sensible arrangement, but with something more calculating, as if he were assessing her value against an amount she did not know she represented. In the 3rd year, she had found a letter. She had not been searching. She had been looking for the household accounts book, which Gerald kept in his desk drawer, and which she needed to reconcile the quarterly expenses. The letter had been folded inside the accounts book, as if placed there deliberately or left there carelessly. She had never been entirely sure which. It was from a firm of money lenders in London. It outlined, in the flat, precise language of men who deal in debt professionally, the current balance of what Gerald owed them. The figure was considerable. The interest was compounding. And at the bottom, in a different hand, a hand she recognized immediately because she had received enough formal correspondence in her previous life to know the handwriting of a woman who signed everything with the same careful authority. There was a notation. Arrangements as discussed. The asset remains in place. Do not contact the subject directly. The asset. Eleanor had stood at Gerald's desk with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she had put it back exactly where she found it, closed the drawer, gone upstairs, and sat on the edge of her bed and been very, very still for approximately 10 minutes. Then she had gone back downstairs and made supper and helped James with his letters, and done everything that was required of her with perfect composure, because composure was the only weapon she had, and she had learned, in the hardest possible school, not to deploy it carelessly. She arranged it, Eleanor said. Her voice was level. It had the quality of something that has been said, privately, many times before, turned over and examined so often that it no longer has the power to shock, only to exhaust. Lady Sinclair. She found Gerald through the money lenders. I believe he owed them before she became involved, and she purchased the debt. That gave her leverage over him. She then directed him, I think is the word, toward me. Edmund was very still. She arranged your marriage. She arranged the conditions that made it likely, Eleanor said carefully. Mrs. Patton, the widow who took me in, I think now that she was not as accidental a kindness as she seemed. She knew exactly who I was. She was very warm. She introduced me to several people, and Gerald was among them, and he was very attentive at a time when I had very little basis for comparison. She paused. I don't believe Mrs. Patton knew the full picture. I think she was simply told to be helpful to a woman in difficulty, and to mention, in due course, that Gerald Harwell was a widower of good standing. The rest arranged itself. Edmund looked at the table. Why, he said. Why go to that trouble? She had already removed you. What did she gain by placing you here, specifically? Eleanor looked at him. Control, she said simply. Over James. She couldn't be certain, when she sent me away, that I wouldn't find some means of proving what she had done, or of reaching you, or of establishing James's legitimacy through legal channels. As long as I was destitute and alone, I was manageable. But a woman with nothing can become desperate, and desperate women do unpredictable things. She wrapped her hands around her cup. But a woman with a house, with a husband, with a child settled in a school, and a name that gave him protection, that woman has something to lose. That woman stays where she is put. That woman does not make trouble, because making trouble risks everything she has built. She paused. She gave you just enough to keep you still. Yes, said Alina. That is exactly what she did. The last year had been different. Alina described it quietly and without drama. The drinking worsening, the late-night visitors more frequent, Gerald's temper shortening in ways that had not yet become dangerous, but had begun to carry the particular quality of a man who is running out of road. He had borrowed more, she believed, beyond what Lady Sinclair's firm held from other sources, less patient ones. He had made promises he could not keep. And recently, in the last few months, he had begun looking at Alina again with that calculating expression, but differently now. Less like a man assessing value, and more like a man considering how to liquidate an asset he no longer wanted to maintain. He said something to me, Alina said. 3 weeks ago. We had argued about money, about the household accounts, which he has been increasingly unwilling to let me manage. He said, she stopped. He said that I should remember who had given me a name, and that names could be taken away as easily as they were given. Edmund looked at her. He threatened you. He reminded me of my position, Alina said, with a precision that was itself a form of anger, which amounts to the same thing. And James is the reason I have not left. She said it flatly, without apology. An unmarried woman with an illegitimate child has no legal standing. If Gerald chose to contest custody, if he chose to make public the circumstances of James's birth, I would have no recourse. None. The law does not protect women in my position, Edmund. It never has. The kitchen was very quiet. Edmund thought about the law. He thought about what he could do within it, and what he could do outside it, and which of those paths would be faster. He was a duke. He had lawyers in 4 cities and a solicitor who had never once failed to find a solution to a problem that other men had declared insoluble. He thought about Gerald Harwell, who had spent 6 years living in a house with Edmund's son and calling him boy. He kept his voice level with some effort. I need to know everything, he said. Every debt, every name, every late-night visitor you can remember. I need it all. Alina looked at him. What are you going to do? I'm going to take him apart, Edmund said quietly. Legally. Completely. And then I am going to ensure that he cannot put himself back together. They heard the front door at 2:30. Alina was on her feet before the sound had finished, not running, not panicked, but moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has spent years calculating exactly how much time she has between a door opening and a confrontation she is not ready for. Go, she said very quietly. Alina. Through the garden. The gate at the far end opens onto the lane. Go now, before he comes to the kitchen. Edmund stood. He looked at her, at this woman who had just spent an hour handing him the architecture of 6 years of careful survival, and he said, equally quietly, I will come back. I know, she said. And the way she said it, not relieved, not grateful, but certain, the way a person is certain of a thing they have stopped hoping for and started believing, was the most important thing anyone had said to Edmund in a very long time. He went through the garden. He found the gate. He came out onto the lane just as he heard, from inside the cottage, Gerald Harwell's voice calling for his wife. He stood on the lane for a moment. James was at the far end of the garden, still engaged with the wall, still narrating to himself in the low, serious voice of a child absorbed in something important. He had not seen Edmund leave. He was crouched over something in the grass, a beetle, perhaps, or another frog, with his coat sleeves pushed up and his dark eyes focused, and his whole small person radiating the absolute contentment of a child who has had, so far, A very satisfactory morning. Edmund watched him for a moment longer than he should have. Then he turned and walked back toward Ashworth House, and his face, for the first time in 6 years, had lost the careful blankness he had worn like armor. He was angry. He was angry in the clean, focused, entirely purposeful way of a man who has finally identified the problem and is ready at last to solve it. Gerald Harwell came home that afternoon with the smell of drink on him and the expression of a man who had received bad news and was deciding who to blame for it. He found Alina in the parlor, mending. James was at the table with his books. The scene was exactly as it always was, orderly, quiet, a household running on Alina's invisible effort. And Gerald stood in the doorway and looked at it all with the dissatisfied air of a man who has been given something he wanted and has since decided he wants something else. "There was a carriage outside this morning," he said. "A good one." "Whose was it?" Alina did not look up from her mending. "I didn't notice a carriage." "Mrs. Cole said she saw a man at our gate." "I couldn't say. I was at Mrs. Bourne's until midday." Gerald looked at James. "Boy, was there a man at the gate this morning?" James looked up from his book. He looked at Gerald with the calm, assessing expression he used for things he had not yet decided about. "A man helped me when I fell," he said. "He fixed my knee. Then he left." Gerald looked at the mended knee. Looked at Alina. "Who was he?" "A traveler," said James. "He was very kind." Gerald stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he went to his study and closed the door, and Alina listened to the sound of the decanter being opened, and she kept her eyes on her mending and her face entirely composed. James watched her from across the table. "Mama," he said quietly. "Yes, darling." Edmund said he was going to try to fix it. Alina's needle paused. Just for a moment. "Did he?" "I think he meant it," said James. "He had the face of someone who means things." Alina looked at her son, at his dark eyes, steady and serious, watching her with the particular attention of a child who understands more than he is supposed to, and something moved through her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope. She had been so careful not to feel it. Hope was the most dangerous thing she knew, more dangerous than Gerald's temper, more dangerous than Lady Sinclair's reach, more dangerous than the law and its indifference and all the ways it had failed to protect her. Hope made you lean toward something. Hope made you want. And wanting, in her experience, was how you got hurt. But her son was looking at her with Edmund's eyes and telling her that Edmund had the face of someone who means things, and she found, despite everything, despite 6 years of careful, disciplined, well-earned caution, that she believed him. She went back to her mending. In his study, Gerald poured a second drink and sat at his desk and stared at nothing, and after a while he reached for paper and a pen and wrote a short letter, 3 sentences, no more, and sealed it and put it in his coat pocket to post in the morning. It was addressed to London, to the firm whose name appeared at the bottom of the letter Alina had found in the household accounts 3 years ago. And at the top, in Gerald's cramped, slightly unsteady hand, he had written 4 words that would, within 48 hours, reach a woman in a very good house in Mayfair who had spent 6 years believing she had thought of everything. He is here. Sinclair. Lady Sinclair arrived in Ashworth on Monday morning. This was not, Edmund realized later, a surprise. He had written to her, carefully, strategically, a letter that revealed nothing while implying everything, designed to draw her out before she could fortify herself behind lawyers and distance, and the long-practiced composure of a woman who had spent 40 years getting exactly what she wanted. He had expected her to send an intermediary. A solicitor, perhaps. A carefully worded response. He had not expected her to come herself. But then, he reflected, he had perhaps underestimated how alarmed Gerald's letter had made her. And Lady Sinclair, alarmed, apparently preferred to manage things in person. She arrived at Ashworth House at 10 o'clock with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and the expression of a woman paying a perfectly ordinary social call. She kissed Edmund on the cheek. She admired the house. She accepted tea. Edmund waited until the maid had withdrawn and the door was closed. Then he sat down across from his mother and looked at her, and did not say anything, and let the silence do its work. She lasted 4 minutes before she spoke first. This was, Edmund suspected, longer than most people would have managed. "You've been making inquiries," she said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. Her hands were perfectly still. "I have," said Edmund. "About Eleanor. Among other things." Lady Sinclair set down her teacup. She looked at her son with the expression he had seen her use on tradesmen, on tenants, on anyone who had come to her with a grievance she had already decided was not going to succeed. Composed, faintly patient. The expression of a woman waiting for the other person to finish before explaining why they are wrong. "Edmund," she said, "whatever you have been told." "Thomas Reeve," he said. A pause. Very small. Almost invisible. But Edmund had spent 35 years reading his mother's face, and he saw it. "Thomas Reeve," he repeated, "signed a false statement. For £50. Which you paid him. Thomas Reeve is a man who left your service under questionable circumstances, and who has every reason to." "Dr. Alcott." Another pause. Longer this time. "Dr. Alcott told you, in August of that year, that Eleanor's confinement was expected in January. He told me the same. And then in October, his written report said something different. Dr. Alcott, who retired the following year and moved to the continent, where I understand he lives very comfortably for a man of his former income." Lady Sinclair said nothing. "The letter," Edmund continued. His voice had not changed. He was rather proud of that. "The one supposedly found in Eleanor's travel case. I have had it examined by a man whose entire professional life has been devoted to the analysis of documents. The paper, he tells me, was manufactured no earlier than 18 months before Eleanor and I married. The ink composition is consistent with a supplier in London who stock Eleanor, who grew up in Shropshire and had no London connections before our marriage, would have had no reason to use. And the handwriting," he paused, "is not a match for any sample of Eleanor's correspondence in my possession. But it is an interesting match for something else." He reached into his coat and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. It was a sample of handwriting. Disguised but not quite well enough, the particular formation of certain letters, the slight leftward lean, the way the capital E was made in 3 strokes instead of 4. Edmund had noticed it 3 days ago, and had spent an entire evening being certain before he allowed himself to be certain. Lady Sinclair looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at her son, and for the first time in Edmund's memory, he saw something move through her face that was not composure. Not quite fear. Something older than fear and more honest. She had not expected him to find the letter. "I did it for you," she said. Edmund said nothing. "She was not right for you. She was not the match this family needed. She had no connections, no fortune, no. She was my wife. She was a mistake. A young man's mistake, made in haste, without proper consideration of what the Sinclair name requires. I spent 30 years building what this family is, Edmund. 30 years beside a man who was kind but not strategic, who would have let it all drift away on sentiment if I had not. She stopped, gathered herself. I protected you. That is what I did. I protected you from a woman who would have diminished everything we are. You sent a pregnant woman into the rain, Edmund said. In October. Alone. She was not alone. Gerald, Edmund said, and something shifted in his voice on that word, not louder, not harder, but different in a way that made Lady Sinclair go still. Gerald Harwell, whose debts you purchased. Gerald Harwell, whom you directed toward Eleanor when she was at her most vulnerable, in a village you had selected, through a widow you had primed. Gerald Harwell, who has spent 6 years watching my son grow up and calling him boy. Lady Sinclair's chin lifted. The child's legitimacy was never. His name is James, said Edmund. He is 5 years old. He builds fortresses out of garden stones and reads natural history, and he has my eyes and my jaw and Eleanor's intelligence and Eleanor's courage. And he has spent 5 years in a house with a man who looks at him like an inconvenience, because you decided that Eleanor was not good enough for the Sinclair name. He leaned forward, just slightly. His voice dropped. You will tell me, right now, everything. Every name, every arrangement, every favor called in and debt manipulated. Everything you know about Gerald Harwell's finances and his connections, and whatever hold you believe you still have over this situation. You will tell me all of it. And then you and I will discuss what happens next. Lady Sinclair looked at her son across the table. This son she had made, she had shaped. She had given everything she had to build into something worthy of the name he carried, and saw something in his face she had not seen before. He was not angry in the way she had seen him angry before. He was not the anger of a young man, hot and recoverable. This was something colder, something final. She told him everything. It took 40 minutes. Gerald's original debt had been to a different firm entirely. A gambling debt, reckless and substantial, accumulated over 2 years of poor judgment and worse company. Lady Sinclair had purchased it through intermediaries 18 months after Eleanor's removal, by which point she had located Eleanor in Ashworth through a network of household staff and local contacts that Edmund found, as she described it, both impressive and nauseating. She had not arranged Eleanor's marriage precisely. She had, as Eleanor had suspected, arranged the conditions. Mrs. Patton had been a genuine widow, not a conspirator, but she had been a woman who owed Lady Sinclair a favor from 20 years previous, the nature of which Lady Sinclair declined to specify, and who had been asked simply to be kind to a woman in difficulty, and to mention, in due course, that Gerald Harwell was a man of reasonable standing who was looking for a wife. The rest had been Eleanor's own choices, made under pressure Lady Sinclair had engineered but not applied directly. This distinction appeared to matter to Lady Sinclair. Edmund did not find it meaningful. The hold over Gerald was financial. He owed the firm, which Lady Sinclair controlled through a series of intermediary arrangements, a sum that had compounded over 6 years to something well beyond his ability to repay. In exchange for forbearance, he had provided occasional intelligence. Eleanor's movements, James's development, anything that might indicate Eleanor was considering legal action or contact with Edmund. He had sent in 6 years 11 letters. Lady Sinclair had, until 3 days ago, considered the arrangement stable. When she finished, Edmund was quiet for a long time. He stood. He walked to the window. He looked out at the Ashworth garden, the bare trees, the gray sky, The ordinary English afternoon going about its business, with complete indifference to the conversation that had just taken place inside. Then he turned around. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. "Gerald Harwell's debt will be settled. Not forgiven, settled, in full through my solicitor, with a legal instrument that releases him from all obligations to you or your firm. He will also sign papers relinquishing any claim to James, including the right to contest the boy's parentage or custody. In exchange, he will receive enough to clear his other debts and enough to leave Ashworth permanently. I will give him 1 week." Lady Sinclair opened her mouth. "I am not finished," said Edmund. "The firm will be wound up. I will handle this quietly, because a public dissolution would raise questions I prefer not to answer in a courtroom, and because the people whose money is in it are not all as culpable as you are. But it will be wound up. Within the month. Edmund, you cannot simply—" "I can," he said. "I have the documentation. I have Thomas Reeves' testimony. I have the letter analysis. I have Gerald Harwell, who will tell me everything he knows if the alternative is debtor's prison, which it is. I have enough, Mother, to ruin you publicly and completely. I am choosing not to do that." He paused. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because James does not deserve to grow up knowing his grandmother was exposed in a public scandal, and because Eleanor has had enough of other people's choices made on her behalf, and because I am tired, I am profoundly, irreversibly tired of this family treating people as pieces to be moved." Lady Sinclair sat very straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was composed in a way that took, Edmund could see, considerable effort. "And me," she said finally. "What happens to me?" Edmund looked at her for a moment. This woman who had made him, who had taught him to be precise and disciplined and unsentimental, who had loved him in her way, he did not doubt that, even now, even here, and who had used that love as the justification for something that had cost Eleanor 6 years and James a father and Edmund the one part of his life that had made the rest of it feel like it was for something. "You will go back to London," he said. "You will not contact Eleanor. You will not contact Gerald. You will not involve yourself, directly or indirectly, in anything relating to James. If you do any of those things, any of them, I will take everything I have to the Lord Chancellor personally. Do you understand me?" A long pause. "Yes," said Lady Sinclair. Very quietly. "I understand." Edmund nodded. "You can finish your tea," he said. "Your carriage will be ready within the hour." He stood at the window and watched her carriage go down the drive, and he felt nothing for a moment. Just the particular blankness that follows the end of something large. Then he felt it. Everything he had held at bay for the duration of that conversation, controlled and set aside because control was what the moment required. It arrived all at once, not as anger but as something rawer. The 6 years. The morning in the study. Eleanor in the rain. James building fortresses alone in a garden, growing up in a house where someone called him boy. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he called for his coat. His horse. And he rode not to Millfield Cottage, not yet. There were things that needed to be done first, legal things, permanent things. But out onto the open road north of Ashworth, where there was no one to see him and the wind was cold and the fields went on forever in every direction. He rode for an hour. When he came back, his face was composed again. His hands were steady. He sat at the writing desk and he wrote 3 letters to his London solicitor, to a barrister he trusted, and to Gerald Harwell, and he sealed them and sent them and felt, for the first time in 6 years, that he was moving in the right direction. That evening, he walked to Millfield Cottage. He knocked at the kitchen door, the back door, not the front, because the front door was Gerald's and the kitchen door was Eleanor's, and he was done, permanently and completely, with making the wrong choices about which doors to use. She opened it herself. She looked at him. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made something in her own face change. Not soften exactly, because Eleanor did not soften easily and he did not expect her to. But settle. The way a person settles when they have been braced for impact, and the impact has finally come, and they discover they are still standing. "It's done," she said. "It will be," he said. "Within the week. I need you to trust me for 7 more days." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Outside, from somewhere upstairs, they could both hear James singing to himself, something tuneless and cheerful and entirely his own. 7 days, she said. And she stood back from the door. Gerald Harwell read Edmund's letter twice. The first time quickly, the way a man reads something he is hoping has been misunderstood. The second time slowly, the way a man reads something when he has confirmed it has not been. The letter was brief. It outlined, in the flat, precise language of a solicitor who has been given clear instructions, the following. Gerald's debt had been purchased in full by the Duke of Harcliffe. Gerald's obligation to the Sinclair firm was therefore extinguished. In its place, Gerald was offered a settlement, a sum sufficient to clear his remaining debts and establish himself elsewhere, contingent on the signing of 2 documents. The first relinquished all parental claim to one James William Harwell. The second committed Gerald to permanent removal from Ashworth, with a radius of 50 miles, within 7 days. At the bottom, in Edmund's own hand rather than the solicitor's, was a single additional line. "If you decline, I will see you in court. You will not enjoy it." Gerald sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about the debt, which was real and substantial, and had been keeping him awake for 2 years. He thought about Edmund Sinclair, who was a duke with lawyers in 4 cities and the kind of face that suggested he said exactly what he meant. He thought about Eleanor, who had been looking at him lately with an expression he recognized as the absence of fear, which was considerably more alarming than fear itself. He signed both documents before lunch. He was packed by Thursday. Eleanor watched Gerald's carriage go from the parlor window. James stood beside her. He was quiet, unusually quiet, for James, watching the carriage until it turned the corner and was gone. Then he looked up at his mother. "Is he coming back?" "No," said Eleanor. James considered this with the focused, careful expression he brought to things that mattered. "Are you sad?" Eleanor looked at her son. She thought about what honesty meant at 5 years old and what it cost and what it was worth. "No," she said. "I'm not sad." James nodded slowly. "Then, is Edmund coming?" Eleanor blinked. "Why would you ask that?" "Because he said he was going to fix it," said James, with the patient logic of someone explaining something obvious to someone who has momentarily forgotten it. "And it looks like it's getting fixed." Eleanor looked at her son for a moment. Then she looked out the window at the empty lane. "Yes," she said. "I think he might be. He came at 7, after James was in bed." Not through the kitchen this time. Eleanor had left the front door unlocked, and he had knocked once, very quietly, and she had opened it herself, and they had stood in the small entrance hall of Millfield Cottage with the fire going in the parlor behind her, and the smell of the evening meal still in the air, and 6 years of everything between them like weather. "It's done," he said. "Gerald is gone. The documents are signed. James is legally, formally, irrevocably mine. If you'll allow it. Eleanor looked at him. You did all of that in 7 days. I had 6 years of motivation. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Something older than a smile and more careful. She stood back from the door. He came inside. They sat in the parlor, and Edmund told her everything. The documents, the solicitor, the legal instrument that restored James's legitimacy under his father's name. He told her about his mother, not everything, not all of it, but enough. Lady Sinclair had returned to London. The firm was being dissolved. There would be no public scandal, because Eleanor did not need a public scandal, she needed a life. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. This was, Edmund had remembered, one of the things he had loved about her, the quality of her attention. She listened the way she looked at things, completely, carefully, without performing a reaction before she had finished forming one. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want, Edmund?" He looked at her. "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that whatever you answer, I will respect it. James is mine. That is not conditional on anything. His name, his future, his place at Harcliffe Hall if he wants it, all of that is settled regardless of what you say to me tonight. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. "Good," he paused. "That night, in the study, when I told you to leave, when you walked out the door, I watched you go. From the upstairs window. I don't know if you knew that." Eleanor was very still. "I didn't. I stood at that window for a long time after the carriage left. And I told myself I had done the right thing. I told myself that every day for 6 years. And I was wrong. I was so entirely and catastrophically wrong. And I cannot give you those years back. And I cannot undo what I did, and I know that. But I need to ask you." He stopped, looked at his hands, then at her. "Is there anything left? Of what we had? Is there anything I haven't destroyed?" It was not quite a question. It came out too raw for a question. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs James shifted in his sleep, one thump, the sound of a small boy turning over and then silence. "I painted your portrait," she said finally. 3 years ago. From memory and a miniature I kept in the lining of a glove. I told myself it was for James, so he would know what his father looked like." She paused. That was partly true. Edmund looked at her. He did not speak. He understood, from 35 years of being a precise man, that this was not the moment for speaking. "I am not the same person I was," Eleanor said. 6 years ago I was younger than I knew. I am not angry at her, that younger woman, for loving you the way she did. But I am not her anymore. And what I might feel now, what might be possible now, would be different. Slower. Less certain." "I know," said Edmund. "You would have to earn it. I know. It might take a long time." "Eleanor," he said very quietly, "I have been patient about exactly nothing in my entire life. I am willing to learn." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stood and went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down something small, a miniature in a plain frame that she had carried in the lining of a glove from one life to another. She held it out to him. He took it, looked at it, his own young face, painted the year they married, the year everything had briefly been exactly what it should have been. "Keep it," she said. "I have the other one now." James came downstairs at 6:30, as he always did, and found Edmund sitting at the kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway, looked at Edmund, looked at his mother, who was at the stove, whose back was turned but whose shoulders had the particular quality of someone trying not to smile. Looked back at Edmund. "You stayed," he said. "I slept in the guest room," Edmund said, because this seemed important to establish. James appeared completely uninterested in this detail. "Are you staying for breakfast?" "If that's all right." James came to the table and sat down with the comfortable authority of a child in his own kitchen. "It's all right," he said. "I usually tell Mama about my dreams at breakfast. You can listen if you want." "I would like that very much," said Edmund. Eleanor set porridge on the table. She sat down. The three of them sat in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, and James told them about his dream, something elaborate involving a castle, a frog who turned out to be a general, and a battle strategy that James considered quite sound. And Edmund listened to every word, and Eleanor watched Edmund listen, and outside the window the morning came up gray and ordinary and entirely sufficient. Edmund had visited every day for 3 weeks. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for the whole afternoon. He had helped James build a new fortress, a more architecturally sophisticated one, with a proper gatehouse. He had read 2 chapters of the pirate book. He had walked with Eleanor along the eastern lane on 4 occasions, and they had talked carefully, slowly, the way people talk when they are rebuilding something from the foundation and want to do it right this time. On a Sunday afternoon, while Eleanor was inside and Edmund and James were in the garden, James set down his stick and looked at Edmund with the focused, preparatory expression of a child who has been working up to something for some time. "Are you my father?" he said. Edmund was quiet for a moment. He had known this was coming. He had thought about it carefully, because James deserved careful thought, and because the wrong answer, or the right answer given badly, was something Edmund was not willing to risk. "Yes," he said. "I am." James absorbed this with the same focused calm he brought to everything. "Why didn't you live with us?" "Because I made a very serious mistake," Edmund said. "And by the time I understood it, I didn't know where to find you. But I looked. And when I found you, I came." This was not, strictly speaking, entirely accurate. He had not been looking, he had stumbled. But James was 5, and the emotional truth of it was real, and Edmund had decided that emotional truth was the kind that mattered most at the beginning. James thought about it. "Did you know about me before you found me?" "No," said Edmund. I didn't know you existed. And I am very sorry for that. Not knowing is not an excuse, but it is the truth." James looked at the fortress, then at Edmund, then back at the fortress. "Mama says the truth is always better than a comfortable lie," he said. "Even when it's hard." "Your mother is right," said Edmund. "She usually is," said James. And then, with the sudden decisive energy of a child who has concluded one thing and is ready to move to the next, "Can you help me with the gatehouse? The arch keeps falling down." "Yes," said Edmund. "I can do that." They worked on the gatehouse together until Eleanor called them in for supper, and James explained the engineering problem in considerable detail, and Edmund listened and offered suggestions, and by the time they went inside the arch was standing. It was an evening in November, and the fire was going, and James was asleep, and Edmund and Eleanor were sitting in the parlor in the particular comfortable quiet that had developed, gradually and without announcement, over the past several weeks. Edmund looked at the fire for a while. Then he said, "I would like to ask you something." Eleanor looked at him. "All right." "Not tonight," he said. "I'm not asking tonight. I'm telling you that I intend to ask, so that you have time to think about it before I do. So that it doesn't arrive without warning." Elinor was quiet for a moment. That is a very careful way to ask something. I am trying to do things carefully, he said. It does not come naturally to me. I am working on it. Elinor looked at him. In the firelight he looked not younger exactly. Not the man she had married. But something better than that young man, she thought. Something that had been through something, and had come out the other side of it knowing more than it had going in. Edmund, she said. Yes. Ask me now. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did. She said yes. Not immediately. There was a pause, and in that pause lived 6 years and everything they had cost, and Elinor sat with them and did not rush past them, because they deserved to be sat with. But she said yes. Clearly and without qualification, and with the particular quality of certainty that belongs only to people who have thought about something for a very long time and have finally, at last, decided. Harcliffe Hall in April was a different thing entirely from Harcliffe Hall in October. In October, it was stone and bare trees, and the particular gray grandeur of a house that takes itself seriously. In April, the gardens came alive. The south-facing beds first, then the long borders along the eastern walk, then the sweet peas that Elinor had instructed be planted along the wall within the first week of their arrival, because she had decided, early and without discussion, that Harcliffe Hall needed sweet peas, and that was the end of it. James had agreed enthusiastically. The bees, he explained to the head gardener, required them. The head gardener, who had worked at Harcliffe Hall for 22 years and had not previously been required to make decisions based on bee welfare, had planted the sweet peas. There were 2 new portraits in the upper gallery. The first was Elinor's, formal, commissioned, painted in the blue dress she had worn on the morning of her return to Harcliffe Hall, which Edmund had chosen entirely on the grounds that it was the color she had been wearing the last morning he had been happy, and he was not a sentimental man, but he was apparently not entirely without sentiment either. The portrait showed a woman of perhaps 30, dark-haired, composed, with the expression of someone who has seen considerable difficulty and has come through it knowing exactly who she is. The second was smaller and hung beside it, and had been painted not by a commissioned artist but by Edmund himself over the course of 3 evenings, working from memory and reference and a stubborn refusal to leave it unfinished. It was not technically accomplished. Edmund would be the first to say so. But it was accurate. It was a boy, perhaps 5 or 6, crouched in a garden over something in the grass, entirely absorbed, his coat sleeves pushed up and his face carrying the focused, joyful attention of a child who finds the world inexhaustibly interesting. Below it in Edmund's handwriting, a small card. James William Sinclair. Age 5. October. Elinor found Edmund at the breakfast table at 6:30. This was unusual. Edmund was not by nature or habit a 6:30 person. He had been making the effort consistently for 4 months. Elinor had not asked him to. He had simply appeared, the second week at Harcliffe Hall, at 6:30 and sat down, and poured his own tea and waited. She had not commented on it. Some things did not need to be commented on. James came downstairs at his usual time with his hair going in the usual directions, and sat down with the usual purposeful energy of a boy who has already decided, before he is fully awake, that the day is going to be interesting. He looked at them both across the table, his mother, his father, with the calm, assessing expression that was entirely his own and entirely recognizable, and had been causing people to feel seen quite accurately for 5 years. "I had a dream," he announced. "Tell us," said Edmund. James told them. It involved a castle, naturally, and a frog, and a complicated question of inheritance law that James had resolved through what he described as a very reasonable negotiation. Edmund listened with the full, careful, complete attention that James had decided, some months ago, was one of his father's better qualities. Eleanor listened and watched Edmund listen and felt, not the young, uncomplicated love of 6 years ago, but something that had more weight to it, more knowledge, more rooms. Something that had been tested and had held. Outside the April windows, the gardens were coming up. The sweet peas were 3 inches high along the eastern wall. A bee, early, optimistic, apparently unbothered by the season, moved through the cold morning air with complete conviction that it was exactly where it was supposed to be. James had discovered in his first week at Harcliffe Hall that there were 11 outbuildings, 4 walled gardens, 2 lakes, and what appeared to be a tunnel under the east wing, whose purpose no one could satisfactorily explain. He was working through them systematically. Edmund walked with him that afternoon through the kitchen garden, along the south border, down toward the lower lake where the reeds were coming up, and something was moving in the water that James identified, with great authority, as either a water vole or a very small otter. They crouched at the water's edge together. Edmund looked at the reeds. James looked at the reeds. Neither of them said anything for a while, which was, Edmund had discovered, one of the things he liked best about James, his perfect comfort with silence, his ability to simply be in a place without needing to fill it. "Father," said James. It was the first time he had used the word unprompted. He had been working up to it. Edmund had watched him working up to it, with the same focused, careful preparation he brought to everything that mattered, and he had clearly decided that the lake was the right moment. Edmund kept his eyes on the reeds. "Yes. Do you think it's a vole or an otter?" Edmund considered. "Vole," he said. "The movement is too quick for an otter." James nodded seriously. "That's what I thought." They stayed at the water's edge for another 20 minutes. The vole appeared once briefly and confirmed itself as a vole, and James narrated the sighting with the thorough satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis has been proven correct. Edmund listened to every word. On the walk back, James took his hand. Not dramatically, not as a moment, just practically, the way a child takes a hand on uneven ground, without ceremony or announcement. Edmund held it carefully. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the afternoon had not already said better. After James was in bed, 2 chapters of a new book, this one involving a boy who discovers a door in his garden that leads somewhere unexpected, which James considered extremely plausible. Edmund and Eleanor stood together at the window of the upper sitting room, looking out over the gardens in the last of the April light. The sweet peas were doing well. The east border was coming up. Somewhere down by the lower lake a heron stood in the reeds, with the permanent patience of a creature that has decided the best strategy is simply to outlast everything. "He called me father today," Edmund said. "I know," said Eleanor. "He told me at supper." Very casually, as if it were something he had always done. "He's like you," Edmund said. "He does important things without making them into occasions." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He's like you too," she said. "The way he focuses. The way he gets very still when something matters." Edmund looked at her. She was looking at the garden, her profile clear against the last of the light. The woman who had walked out of his house into the October rain and had not broken, and had not waited, and had not kept a candle in the window, and had built something out of what was left and had been still standing when he finally, far too late and exactly in time, came to find her. "Eleanor," he said. That night, when you left, you said I would understand one day. And that on that day, you wouldn't be waiting." She turned to look at him. "You weren't," he said. "You weren't waiting. You had built a life and you were living it. And I came and asked you to dismantle it and start again, and you said yes. And I need you to know," he stopped. "I need you to know that I understand what that cost, and that I will spend however long you give me making sure it was worth it." Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked back at the garden. "It was already worth it," she said. "James called you father today." Edmund said nothing. There was, again, nothing to say. She leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her. They stood at the window while the light finished and the garden went dark and the heron, presumably, continued its infinite patience down at the lake.